levels of trust in the community.
Dr. Ortiz spoke to it so eloquently. I'll just kind of amplify some of the things that he shared, which I think are really powerful given the moment and the way that Dr. Scott talked about how we should all be concerned. Because the reality is one community's emancipatory moment is another community's moment of reckoning. And if we don't recognize that, then we find ourselves in a moment like we do now where everybody's looking at the immigration crisis and ICE and the assault on the 14th Amendment going, not our problem, it will be our problem.
Yes.
Not too soon off,
That's
it will
right.
be our problem. It's already our problem now.
Yeah.
But in the way that you frame that question, Dr. Musa, there's a great book by a sociologist named Rothman on his side. He wrote about prisons in the 1970s. And what he wrote about prisons was, every generation discovers prisons. He's shocked and disgusted by what it discovers. Vows to do the work of reimagining incarceration, only to tire of the work and to walk away to have the next generation come along and go, how come no one's ever done anything about prisons? That's our cycle, right? And the young people then predictably, in the way that Dr. Scott talked about, come into those conversations and they don't either believe there is a history or don't have the time to interrogate it because all they see is a record of failure. And that record of failure then becomes the way in which we talk about reform efforts. And reform in and of itself is problematic because in the way that Dr. Ortiz talked about it, we'd really be talking about reimagination. And our reimagination moments are lost in our being wedded to models of intervention that privilege the federal government. In Minneapolis, the feds are claiming, a lot of people are claiming that the work of reform is done. But we still have a state human rights consent decree. So we can still hold the Minneapolis. Now, we lost the constitutional policing piece, that is true. And I wanted that First Amendment, 14th Amendment protections. But the reality is, we still have power in our community to create accountability, and we have to lean into that more deliberately now more than ever. Where are the spaces where we can exert that control and to be very, very active in those spaces? I will say this in relation also to what Dr. Ortiz said, Dr. Scott, and my pastor, my friend pastor, Dr. Loudon. When Dr. Scott said we think about the Kerner Commission, two societies separate and equal, the problem with the way that people think about law enforcement is there's 6 degrees of segregation which we see on display in our country at all times, in housing, education, access to places of public accommodation. The reality is, in the way that policing is insidious, is that we focus on when the cops show up and bust in somebody's window in a car at 2 o'clock in the morning. We don't ask the questions about the policies, practices, and procedures that led us there, the bad law, the bad policy. The police often show up to the party to enforce bad law, and we don't hold accountable the lawmakers who think that the way to deal with these issues is producing more bad law. So we find ourselves in this kind of echo of that cycle. And then Dr. Ortiz spoke to funding. And this is the perennial problem. And yet I also point to the work of the National Alliance for Faith and Justice that's done this both with funding and without funding. Lean into our churches, lean into our houses of worship, our community leaders, amplify the work of law enforcement professionals, the work that Dr. Ortiz just talked about in Baltimore, the work that's happening in Minneapolis, where you have law enforcement persons who are looking at the criminal legal system from the standpoint of how we do community reimagination, community rejuvenation. I want to be very clear and specific what I mean about that, and then I'll turn it over. In 1974, Minneapolis actually had ride-alongs with social workers. The police union pushed back on that. The police union said, we don't want these social workers in the car. You had the few black officers on force, one named Raymond Presley, who was like, no, you need this. This is good. This will be good for accountability. And the following year, when they implemented new training for the police, they had 14 hours of transactional analysis, 96 hours of karate. 14 hours of transactional analysis, how to speak to the public, how to use honorifics, how to engage in all the stuff that we see in consent decrees across the country in terms of how to engage community. Well, let's be clear, if I get 96 hours of karate and only 14 hours of transactional analysis, when I show up, I know how to knock heads more than I know how to speak to you in a way that would encourage any kind of real. So when we hear about a reduction in, for example, juvenile offenses and drop in juvenile crime, It's because the people who are imaginative are at the table and then empowered in a way to do that work of reimagination. It's the work of this body, it's the work of the National Alliance for Faith and Justice. We gotta privilege that work, y'all, because I'm telling you right now, if we don't lean in, all the things that we've been talking about and all the ways that are scary to us are going to come to fruition. And then we look back at that history, then we have to ask the question, what organizations were at the front line? Black civic fraternal organizations, the Black church, right? And these are all institutions which are under assault. So we really can't afford the Rothman